Now that we have learned the anatomy of blood vessels and learned the different tunics that make up blood vessel walls, we're going to shift our focus to blood vessel location and identification. While everyone's body is unique and has differences, one thing that will remain the same between individuals is the location of their blood vessels. As we know, the systemic blood vessels will take oxygenated blood out to the tissues and eventually, after offloading oxygen at the tissues, will take deoxygenated blood back to the heart. It is our body's systemic arteries and systemic veins that we're going to focus on identifying in this lab presentation. One of the other things that we know is that our systemic blood vessels will arise from the aorta coming out of the left ventricle. And all of our other systemic vessels will branch in some way from the aorta. As our vessels get smaller and smaller, they're eventually going to become arterioles and then transition into capillaries where the gas exchange can take place. From here, capillaries will start to merge and form venules, and then venules will merge and form much larger veins. We will make some time in this presentation not only to cover the systemic arteries, but we're also going to locate some of the systemic veins as well. So let's go ahead here and take a look at the first branches that come off of the aorta. The aorta can be separated into several parts based on the direction of blood flow in that part of the aorta. We will find that we have the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, as well as the descending aorta. Just to real quickly show you this, the aorta is going to come out of the heart, and then as the aorta comes up, this is the ascending aorta, we'll have the arch of the aorta, which will loop over here, and then the descending aorta will take blood down through the thoracic cavity and into the abdominal cavity. The first three branches that we want to focus on with our systemic arteries can be found branching from the aortic arch. These three branches refer to the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. It is these three vessels that are the major branches off of the aortic arch in the human body. This picture will show us these three branches. So here's the ascending aorta that's going to arise from the heart, and as the aorta arches over, we have what's known as the arch of the aorta. Specifically from this arch, we'll find the brachiocephalic artery, we'll find the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. These are the three branches that come from the aortic arch in the human. And it is from these three branches in particular that our thoracic arteries will arise. Now, I am well aware that you all signed up for human anatomy class, and that is how I've described these vessels that branch from the aortic arch. However, in the lab, we will be using cats to identify these different vessels, so we have to be able to account for the differences that are found in the cat compared to the human. And fortunately, we'll come to see that there's only one difference that we'll need to account for on the cat for our quizzes and tests. We'll discuss this difference here next. So in particular, the cat only has two branches that come out of the aortic arch, specifically the brachiocephalic artery and the left subclavian artery. You can see that the difference is that the left common carotid artery is not branching from the aortic arch in the cat. So you might be wondering, where is this vessel? Is the cat simply missing the left common carotid artery? And the answer to that question is no. The cat will in fact have a left common carotid artery, however, it will just be branching out from the brachiocephalic artery instead of branching from the aortic arch. So for example, to compare the branches of the aortic arch in the human to the branches of the aortic arch in the cat, we will see on this human diagram that there are three branches from the aortic arch, and over here with this diagram of the cat, we'll only find two branches of the aortic arch. Hold on to this discrepancy just for a second. We're going to first go over the arteries on the human so that we can understand where these vessels are found and how we identify them, and then we're going to translate our understanding onto the diagram of the cat. So first and foremost, as I've already described, we have the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, and the descending aorta. And truly, the descending aorta is going to go all the way through the thoracic cavity and down to the abdominal pelvic cavity. So in all actuality, we can further separate the descending aorta into the descending thoracic aorta and the descending abdominal aorta that's past the diaphragm. We will see that certain branches will come off of the thoracic aorta and certain branches will come off of the abdominal aorta shortly. But first, let's direct our attention over here to the aortic arch and the three branches that come off of this part of the aorta. So first and foremost, we have the brachiocephalic artery, we have the left common carotid artery, and we have the left subclavian artery. All of these are the three major branches that can be found coming off of the arch of the aorta in the human. From here, we can see that the brachiocephalic artery will branch into two other vessels. The brachiocephalic artery will separate into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. So with this understanding, we can see that we have both a right and a left common carotid artery, and we also have a right and a left subclavian artery. This gives us almost perfect bilateral symmetry with the arteries of the thoracic cavity. We'll have two common carotid arteries that travel up the neck, and we'll have two subclavian arteries that will travel out to the arms. In fact, we give the subclavian artery its name because this vessel will course under the clavicle, hence its name as the subclavian. And as the subclavian artery travels out through the axilla, we start to call this vessel the axillary artery, and as it continues on over here into the arm, into the brachial region, we call it the brachial artery. I will make this distinction for you once again when we make our way onto the diagram of the cat. But let's take a quick second to label each of these vessels so that you can make sure that you understand where these vessels are found and how these vessels branch. So the first branch off the arch of the aorta is the brachiocephalic artery. Notice that the brachiocephalic artery is found slightly on the right side of the body, but we don't call this the right brachiocephalic artery since there's only one of these. That's a very important distinction. Since there's only one brachiocephalic artery, despite the fact that it is found on the right side of the body, we will still refer to this just as the brachiocephalic artery. Now the brachiocephalic artery is the first branch off the arch of the aorta, but we'll also have the left common carotid artery that will course up the neck, and we'll have the left subclavian artery that will course under the left clavicle and eventually give rise to the axillary artery and the brachial artery of the left side of the body as well. Due to the brachiocephalic artery being present here, we can't say that we have perfect bilateral symmetry, but we almost do. We have two common carotid arteries that course up the neck and two subclavian arteries on either side. Here you can see the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery are both branching out from the brachiocephalic artery. So you'll need to be able to identify where each of these vessels are found, and you'll also need to be able to locate these vessels on the cat. Now, if we're going to be identifying these vessels on the cat in particular, we need to make sure that we're accounting for that major difference that we see when we move to the cat. And the cat you can see here only has two branches that come off of the arch of the aorta. This is the brachiocephalic trunk, and this is the left subclavian artery. The left common carotid artery of the cat is still present, however, it's just going to branch from somewhere else. In particular, the left common carotid artery can be found here. And in the cat, this vessel will branch out from the brachiocephalic artery instead. This is the only difference that we will have to account for when we're looking at the blood supply of the cat. Other than this, every single vessel in the cat will be exactly in the same place as it is in the human. So in the cat, the aortic arch has two branches. In the human, the aortic arch has three branches. So I just want to tell you all once more that we do name the subclavian arteries based on the fact that they're found under the clavicles. And as they pass through the axilla, they become the axillary arteries, and as they pass through the brachial region, they become the brachial arteries. It's the same vessel, it's just given different names based on where it's found. So let's take a look at these vessels that can be found on the cat and account for that difference that we will see in this species. So here we find the aortic arch. There's going to be two major branches, our brachiocephalic artery, also known as the brachiocephalic trunk. You can truly call it either. A trunk is just a very short and large vessel, so you can call this the brachiocephalic artery or the brachiocephalic trunk. And our second branch off the aortic arch is the left subclavian artery. This is always going to make its way out to the arm. So if you ever get lost at looking at these vessels, you can trace the vessel out to where it's going to go. That's going to give you an idea of what vessel you're looking at. Over here, branching off the brachiocephalic trunk, is our left common carotid artery, our right subclavian artery, and our right common carotid artery. So hopefully so far, you're getting a good idea of where these vessels can be found and how to identify them. But when it comes time to take the midterm in this class, you'll have to be able to identify these vessels on an actual specimen. So we're going to move to this picture to give you guys some practice at identifying these vessels on a real cat. So following the same example from the last slide, we'll see the ascending aorta, which is going to take blood up into the aortic arch, and then the aortic arch is going to have its two branches, the brachiocephalic artery and the left subclavian artery. You can see this vessel here coursing under the clavicle and eventually traveling out to the arm. As we go further down the arm through the axilla and into the brachial region, we'll find the axillary artery and the brachial artery. Once again, I'll just state that this vessel is the same vessel. It's just named based on where it can be found at different locations. As the arrangement of the brachiocephalic artery contains an extra vessel in the cat, we get a very unique Easter egg that we can see if we move the venous structures out of the way. This here is the brachiocephalic artery, which gives rise to our left common carotid artery, our right common carotid artery, and our right subclavian artery. In the human body, the brachiocephalic artery will only have these two major branches. But since we have this third, in the cat we have what's known as the chicken's foot, and that's what this arrangement is referring to. The four vessels that compose the chicken's foot are the brachiocephalic artery, the right subclavian artery, the right carotid artery, and the left carotid artery. So once we have all of these vessels down, that will conclude all of the branches that come off of the arch of the aorta. But as the aorta continues into the descending thoracic aorta, we'll find one other set of vessels that can be found branching from the descending thoracic aorta. Here we'll find our descending thoracic aorta, and this is eventually going to make its way down through the diaphragm, where it will become the descending abdominal aorta as it enters into the abdominal cavity. But specifically, we only have one branch that we need to understand coming from this descending thoracic aorta, and those are the intercostal arteries. Intercostal arteries will course between the ribs. And you can see that there are many different intercostal arteries that will course through here. You can see intercostal arteries here, and here, and here, and also pointed out with these three arrows. So in terms of the arterial supply, we have our branches from the aortic arch, and we have our intercostal arteries that will branch out from the descending thoracic aorta. So one thing that you may have noticed by now is that all of the vessels that we have pointed out have been arteries, and they've all been depicted with a reddish color. We're now going to transition into the veins that will drain all of the areas that are supplied by our thoracic arteries. Just as we saw with blood vessel anatomy, we depict arteries in red as they will carry oxygenated blood, and we'll depict veins in blue as they will carry deoxygenated blood. We're going to compare and contrast the colors of our arteries to our veins when we get to the next slide. But first, let's discuss the venous drainage of the thoracic cavity. So one thing that we already know about our venous drainage is that the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava will directly dump blood into the right atrium. The superior vena cava will drain the blood from all of the veins above the heart, and the inferior vena cava will drain the blood from all of the veins below the heart. Specifically, we're going to see which veins will merge to eventually form the superior and inferior vena cava. So first and foremost, in terms of our thoracic veins, we have jugular veins, subclavian veins, and brachiocephalic veins. And what is quite nice about the venous drainage of our thoracic cavity is that this network of blood vessels will actually show us bilateral symmetry, which just means that the vessels on the right side will look just the same as the vessels on the left side. We know that the common carotid arteries will take oxygenated blood up the neck and into the head. The jugular veins will be the structures that will drain deoxygenated blood that went to the head in the common carotid arteries. We'll have two of these, a right and a left jugular vein, and these structures will eventually merge with our subclavian veins that will be carrying deoxygenated blood back from the arm. When the jugular veins and the subclavian veins merge, they're going to form what are known as brachiocephalic veins. And here with our venous drainage, we will have both a right and a left brachiocephalic vein. Keep in mind, we only had one brachiocephalic artery, and therefore we did not have to denote it as right or left. But here in the venous drainage, we'll have both a right and a left brachiocephalic vein, and therefore it's very important for us to include the side with the name of the vessel. Once the brachiocephalic veins come together, they're going to form the superior vena cava that will dump back into the heart. Let's take a look at these vessels that form the venous drainage of our thoracic cavity. So already we can start to see this bilateral symmetry shown here with our venous drainage. We'll have the two jugular veins, one over here and one over here. This is going to be our left jugular vein, and this will be our right jugular vein. And then we'll have our right subclavian vein and our left subclavian vein. When the jugular veins meet with the subclavian veins, they're going to form the brachiocephalic veins that can be found here. And as we'll have two brachiocephalic veins, a right and a left, these two structures will come together to eventually form the superior vena cava. So our jugular veins are going to come down from the neck. Remember, we have common carotid arteries and jugular veins, and we'll have our two right and left subclavian veins over here that will eventually merge to form the brachiocephalic veins. So you can see the brachiocephalic veins will come together and meet to give us our superior vena cava. This is showing us perfect bilateral symmetry, as we have two jugular veins, two subclavian veins, and two brachiocephalic veins to meet to give us that central superior vena cava. Fortunately, we've already discussed our only discrepancy with the cat. So in fact, the thoracic veins of the cat will be exactly the same as the thoracic veins in the human. You can see that we'll have our right jugular vein and our right subclavian vein, which will both come together to form our right brachiocephalic vein, and then both the right and left brachiocephalic veins come together to form the superior vena cava, which will eventually dump blood back into the heart. There is one other vein that we will see up here in the thoracic cavity, known as the azygos vein. The azygos vein will be shown coming up the backside of the heart, and I will show you this vessel in just a few slides. But first, let's go ahead and identify each of these veins on the cat, and then we'll distinguish between the arterial supply and the venous drainage. So one thing that's very important for us to remember with veins is that veins will continue to merge and get larger. Arteries will eventually get smaller. So in our arteries, blood is flowing out to the body tissues, and in our veins, blood is flowing back to the heart. So we'll first go ahead and point out the left jugular vein, which will eventually merge with the left subclavian vein. Both the jugular vein and the subclavian vein merging will give us our left brachiocephalic vein, and the same exact arrangement can be found on the right side of the body as well. Now we will not see a right jugular vein and a right subclavian vein on this slide, as they were destroyed in the dissection of this cat. But all cats and all humans will have this exact same venous drainage arrangement of the vessels in the thoracic cavity. Once the right and left brachiocephalic veins come together, those are going to meet to form the superior vena cava. The last component of our thoracic venous drainage is the azygos vein, which we can see coursing behind the heart right here. This is an unpaired structure, and it will be found on the right side of the body. But this azygos vein in particular will dump directly into the superior vena cava. You can see the azygos vein shown right here. So at this point, we've learned quite a few thoracic arteries and quite a few thoracic veins. By now, if you're anything like I was when I started learning these vessels, I was getting my arteries and veins confused. So I want to go over each of these vessels once again on this slide, and also give you some tips to help distinguish arteries from veins. So there are three things that you need to determine with any vessel identification. The first question is whether or not you're looking at an artery or a vein, and that can be determined based on the color of the vessel. Red vessels will depict arteries, blue vessels will depict veins. So the first thing that you should look at is what the color of the vessel is. The second thing that you need to determine is whether or not it's a sided structure and what side it's on. For example, if I was pointing to this structure, I would be indicating the left brachiocephalic vein, and I'd need to make sure that I included the left side, as this is a paired structure. But if I was to point to the brachiocephalic trunk instead, that would not be a paired structure, and therefore we don't need to assign a side to the name of that structure. The last thing that we need to determine about each of these vessels is which vessel it is. So remember, when pointing out vessels up here in the neck, we have carotid arteries and we have jugular veins. Over here, as vessels travel out to the arm, we'll have the subclavian veins and also the subclavian arteries. But depending on where is indicated on the arteries, we'll have potentially the axillary artery and the brachial artery as well. So reviewing all of the vessels that we've just discussed, we'll start with the ascending aorta, which will eventually give rise to the arch of the aorta, which can be found here. We must remember that in the cat, there's only two branches off the arch of the aorta, the left subclavian artery and the brachiocephalic artery. Off the brachiocephalic artery, we'll have three branches, the left common carotid artery, the right common carotid artery, and the right subclavian artery. And both of the subclavian arteries will eventually become axillary arteries and brachial arteries depending on where they are. Now eventually, these vessels are going to continue to get smaller and smaller, form capillary beds, and start to merge to eventually come back and form our veins. So the common carotid arteries brought oxygenated blood out to the head, and it is the jugular veins that will take that deoxygenated blood back down from the head to the heart. We'll have our subclavian veins that can be found on each side, draining the arms, and when the jugular veins and subclavian veins come together, that will form our brachiocephalic veins, which are sided structures. This is the left brachiocephalic vein, and this is the right brachiocephalic vein. Both of our brachiocephalic veins will come together to form the superior vena cava, which will receive blood flow from the azygous vein that courses behind the heart before this dumps back into the right atrium. Lastly, as the arch of the aorta continues, that's going to form the descending thoracic aorta, which is where we will find the intercostal arteries branching. So now that we have discussed the major branches off the arch of the aorta and the descending thoracic aorta, we're now going to discuss the branches that come off of the descending abdominal aorta. There are 5 major arteries that will come off of the abdominal aorta, and they are the celiac artery, which can also be referred to as the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric artery, the right and left renal arteries, the inferior mesenteric artery, and the right and left iliac arteries. It is very important that we orient ourselves properly when trying to identify the abdominal arteries versus the thoracic arteries. The dividing line between these groups is the diaphragm. All of these vessels that we've discussed so far are above the diaphragm, and these 5 abdominal branches will all be found below the diaphragm. Let's take a look at these 5 vessels. So first and foremost, the largest vessel that we can see on this slide is the descending aorta, specifically the descending abdominal aorta, as this will be inferior to the diaphragm. And it is off of this descending abdominal portion of the aorta that we're going to have these 5 major branches. Now on this slide, you're only going to see 4 of those branches, as the renal arteries are not shown. But on the next slide, I will show you the renal arteries and where they can be found. So first and foremost is the celiac artery, also known as the celiac trunk. This is the most superior of our 5 branches off the abdominal aorta. Just below the celiac artery, we'll find our superior mesenteric artery that will shoot many branches out to the mesenteries of our large intestine, hence why we call this the superior mesenteric artery. Just under the superior mesenteric artery, we'll have our right and left renal arteries, but again, I will show you those on the next slide. Those will be the 3rd lowest branches that can be found coming off of the abdominal aorta. Just below the renal arteries, we'll find our inferior mesenteric artery, which will also send many branches out to the mesenteries of the large intestine. And the last 2 branches that we will see coming off of the abdominal aorta are what are known as the iliac arteries. The iliac arteries are unique in that they are formed from the termination of the abdominal aorta. The abdominal aorta is going to bifurcate into these 2 vessels, which will fully split the aorta and cause it to end at this location. I've just used a very important word that you've likely not heard before, so I'm going to take a second to describe this word. I mentioned the term bifurcation, as the 2 iliac arteries will be formed from the bifurcation of the aorta. A bifurcation refers to the separation of a vessel, when one vessel separates into 2 vessels. We could technically say that the brachiocephalic artery bifurcates into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery as well. So I just want to make sure that you are comfortable with this word and understand that as the aorta bifurcates, it's going to form the 2 iliac arteries. As promised, I'm showing you the renal arteries on this slide. You'll see our right renal artery and our left renal arteries that will be taking blood out to the kidneys. A surefire way to make sure that you're identifying the renal arteries are if you see them going to the kidneys. If the vessel isn't going directly to the kidneys, it could not possibly be the right or left renal artery. This slide will just show us a diagram of the cat in all 5 of these vessels in their proper order as we go down the abdominal aorta. We first start with the celiac trunk, or the celiac artery, which is the most superior of all of our abdominal arteries. Just below this, we'll have our superior mesenteric artery, which will course out through our mesenteries, and I'll describe mesenteries very shortly. Just below the superior mesenteric artery, we'll have our 2 renal arteries, the right and left renal arteries that will course out to each kidney. Below these, we'll have our inferior mesenteric artery, and then below this one, we'll have our 2 iliac arteries that are formed from the bifurcation of the aorta. One other note that I want to repeat is that the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries will course out and send branches through what are known as mesenteries. Mesenteries are formation of the serous membrane inside of the abdominal pelvic cavity known as the peritoneum, and we can see an example of the mesenteries shown right here. These folds of the peritoneum inside of the abdominal pelvic cavity will eventually cover up the small intestine and will also house blood vessels that will take oxygenated blood out to those organs for energy. Almost the entire small intestine is suspended in mesenteries, and both the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery will supply these vessels that will be found in the mesenteries. So let's take a look at what these vessels will look like on the cat. First and foremost, we need to note that we're now looking at the abdominal pelvic cavity. The diaphragm is going to be found up here, and the first vessel that we need to be able to identify is the abdominal aorta. This is going to be the large red vessel that courses down the entirety of the abdominal pelvic cavity. The most superior branch off the abdominal aorta is the celiac artery, and just below that we'll find our superior mesenteric artery that will course out to the small intestine. It's not labeled on this slide, but the renal arteries will be found just below the superior mesenteric arteries coursing out to the kidneys. Again, we will only be able to identify this as the renal artery if we can see it going to the kidneys. As the abdominal artery continues further down the abdominal pelvic cavity, we'll have the inferior mesenteric, which will also course out to the small intestines. We will see that as the abdominal aorta comes to terminate, it will bifurcate into the two iliac arteries. The two iliac arteries will eventually course down the legs and give rise to all of the vessels that can be found in the leg. One of the major branches that comes from the iliac arteries are the femoral arteries. The femoral arteries are the same vessel structure as the iliac arteries are, and just as we saw with the axillary and brachial arteries, the femoral arteries are the same vessel, they're just named based on where they're found. Just to make sure that this is labeled, we'll have the left renal artery that can be found here, coursing out to the left kidney. So in order for us to accurately identify the abdominal pelvic arteries, we need to understand where each of those vessels are in reference to each other. Sticking to the same theme as we did our thoracic arteries, the abdominal pelvic arteries will all be shown in red. We're now going to take some time to go over the abdominal pelvic veins, which will be much more straightforward than the abdominal pelvic arteries. Just as we had femoral arteries, we'll have femoral veins that will flow into the right and left iliac veins. And our right and left iliac veins will eventually come together to form the inferior vena cava. As the aorta terminated with the two iliac arteries, the two iliac veins come back together to form the inferior vena cava. The only other branching that we need to understand with our abdominal pelvic veins is that the renal arteries will eventually flow into the inferior vena cava from the kidneys. And then the IVC will take blood back up to the right atrium, where all of our deoxygenated blood will eventually get pumped through the right side of the heart and back into the pulmonary circulation, where that blood can be re-oxygenated. On this slide, we can see our abdominal pelvic veins. We'll have our right and left iliac veins, which will eventually come together to form the inferior vena cava. And here you can see our two renal veins that will enter into the IVC as well, and then the inferior vena cava will take blood back up to the heart. The abdominal pelvic veins will also show perfect bilateral symmetry, as they will look the same on either side. Just to show you once again on this slide with the cat diagram, we'll have the iliac veins that come together to form the IVC in the center, which will course up the abdominal pelvic cavity and receive more deoxygenated blood from our right and left renal veins. We don't want to forget the femoral vein that will eventually give rise to our iliac vein. So we can see those structures shown here. Again, keep in mind that our veins are shown in blue and arteries are shown in red. As we saw the abdominal aorta shown here, we'll have the inferior vena cava shown here. The IVC will course right next to the abdominal aorta, and their colors will indicate which vessels are which. Lastly, we can see our left renal vein, which will enter into the IVC and eventually take blood back to the right side of the heart. So to make sure that we have a good understanding of the vessels in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we're going to go through all of the vessels once again that can be found in this space. We ask ourselves the same three questions every time we have a vessel indicated to us. We first need to determine whether it's an artery or a vein based on its color. We then need to determine whether or not it's a sided structure or not. And then we need to determine the overall name of that structure. So here we have the descending abdominal aorta. There are 5 branches that are going to come off of this vessel, starting with the celiac trunk. This will always be the most superior branch, and it will always come off just below the diaphragm. Just below our celiac trunk, we'll find the superior mesenteric artery. Again, this vessel is named because it courses out to the mesenteries, and we can see this traveling out to our small intestines. This is going to be an indicator that we're looking at the SMA. As the abdominal aorta continues further down, we'll see the two branches of the right and left renal arteries. This is the left kidney, so we're looking at the left renal artery in this picture. Both the celiac trunk and the superior mesenteric artery were singular structures. They were not paired, and therefore we do not associate a side with those vessels. But with the renal arteries, we always want to make sure that we're stating whether or not this is the right renal artery or the left renal artery. As we go further down the abdominal aorta, we're going to see the inferior mesenteric artery, which will also course out to the mesenteries. And lastly, where the aorta bifurcates, we'll have our two iliac arteries that will eventually turn into our femoral arteries. Now, after our oxygenated blood is brought out to our body tissues and it starts to return in our venous drainage, we'll see our femoral veins will eventually come back and flow into the iliac veins, which will merge to form the inferior vena cava. You can see the inferior vena cava coursing up the abdominal pelvic cavity right next to the abdominal aorta. The only other branches that are merging with the IVC are the right and left renal veins that will of course come from the kidneys. This inferior vena cava will eventually course back up through the diaphragm and empty back into the right atrium of the heart. This last slide will be discussed in a little bit more detail when we get to the special circulations presentation. The hepatic portal circulation is one of our special circulations that will facilitate the absorption of nutrients from our digestive organs into the bloodstream. Once those nutrients have made their way into the bloodstream, they'll need to be processed through the liver. So certain veins will take an alternative route through the liver back to the IVC to offload those newly absorbed nutrients into the liver. The liver will then process those nutrients so that our bodies have enough energy to function. That will conclude our lab presentation on blood vessel location and identification. If you're struggling with these concepts or have any questions at all, I strongly encourage you to reach out to me for assistance. I can only help you if I know that you are struggling. Our next lab presentation will cover the special circulations, which will be the final topic pertaining to the blood vessels.